Hi, and thank you for tuning in to Noir Histoire. I'm Natasha, and in this episode, I'll be discussing Beast of No Nation. Beast of No Nation is a 2015 Netflix film based on Uzodinma Iweala's 2005 novel about a boy who becomes a child soldier. Set in an unnamed West African country, a violent civil war is being fought between the military and rebel groups. Agu, played by Abraham Atta, is a small boy from a loving, tight-knit family in a village that is in the path of the approaching armies. When the fighting spreads to his village, it is destroyed and his family torn apart. Agu flees in search of safety, but instead finds himself drafted to fight in a rebel group under the commandant, Idris Elba. So the film starts off with our main character as a little boy, with a group of boys, like they're just finding stuff to occupy their time. He's a bit of a dreamer as well as a bit of a hustler. He comes up with this theme. He's always coming up with ideas, it seems. And they found this old television, like the box kind. There's no electricity, and it's missing most of its components. So it's really just a case. They're using their imagination where obviously they can't watch TV, but they're going to perform on television. So pretty much what they do is you sit on the screen side of the TV, and with this being just a box you look through, it gives the appearance of using your imagination of watching television. So he stands off to the side, the other little boys perform and things like that. And he changes the channel, they change what they're performing, he calls out what they should be doing. So there's like they're performing a martial arts movie, there's dancing. It's really cute, right? These little boys playing around, having good, clean fun. But in the midst of this, there's a lot of turmoil. The reason that they're looking for things to occupy their time is that with war nearby, it's disrupted their lives. They can't attend school. So to occupy their time, they're trying to find things to keep themselves busy. Agu comes from a nice family. His dad was previously a teacher, and he's now taken some land and made it available for refugees so they can kind of create a village for themselves where they can have some shelter. His mom is loving. She works hard. She takes care of the family, cooks and whatnot. He has an older brother and a younger sister who's a baby at this point. His older brother, they have like a nice brotherhood, kind of what you would expect boys of that age to do. So the older brother seems to be quite a few years older than him. He's a teenager. He's interested in girls. Like the brother is obsessed with sleeping with some girl. And so Agu, being a little boy, he doesn't understand. And it shows you his innocence. So they play around. He plays a prank on his older brother, and his brother roughs him up, but good-naturedly. They, in turn, come up with hustles, and it's really just like typical stuff that you would expect from kids of that age. They're relatively nice little boys. The war, unfortunately, is now coming to the area, and you can feel the tension mounting. We see his early life where it's peaceful, it's normal, there's not a lot going on in the village, but the war is coming to the area. And so with that, the feel of the place begins to change. They go to church, we see it's joyful, it's a place of community, the preacher gives a sermon. It's pretty subdued at that point, but then they begin singing and playing music. It becomes very lively, everyone's happy, it's a joyous occasion, it's a moment for the community to come together. But then just a little bit later, we see that they've gathered again and they're discussing the war at church. And there's like arguments. It's a completely different vibe from the earlier scene of them being in church and having a regular service. The war is moving closer to the area, and people now want to seek safety, right? We see what looks like a taxi stand and what's most likely the market. And people are scrambling, trying to get out of town. They're hustling, trying to figure out passage to get from this area to another that might offer some kind of safety. So the father and mother, right, we see Agu and his brother, they're talking at night. He's scared, but his older brother tries to reassure him that, daddy is going to send you away because you're a little kid, you'll be safe and whatnot. He tries to ease his fear by joking around with him. But that gives way to the next day of the dad trying to procure passage for them to get to safety. He wants to send his wife and the two youngest children ahead to safety while he and the eldest son remain behind, along with their grandfather. They're able to secure passage for the mother and younger sister, but the driver won't let Agu go. So a difficult decision has to be made, and unfortunately, the family is then divided, right? But not in the way that's anticipated. He ends up having to stay behind with his father and brother because the driver won't take him. And so that just adds tension and uncertainty. He was under the impression that he would be going with his mother, and they now have to say a hasty goodbye to each other, hoping that they'll see each other again in the future, that they'll be reunited. But just a short while later, right, the violence has arrived in the village. It's really just the men left behind. So Agu, his father, his older brother, and his grandfather, who can't really walk. So his brother has to carry him on his back. They're moving through the streets of the village, trying to find safety, trying to hide from the approaching rebels and military as they come into the village. It's a really tense scene because they're trying to be quiet, but you hear all of this gunfire, right? Big rifles. They're in this little space just trying to get out of harm's way, but they can hear the shooting. There are bullet holes and whatnot in the walls. They can see the soldiers fighting against the rebels. It's unsafe, it's uncertain, but in the midst of all of this, you have to try to keep quiet. It's an incredibly dangerous environment. Bullets are passing by, slamming into walls and whatnot, but you can't go anywhere because there's danger outside, but there's also danger inside. You know, there's a tank and things just go from bad to worse. You know, you come face to face with the things that you feared. And it's like in just a matter of mere moments, you lose your entire family. As a little boy in such an environment, how do you survive? Where do you go to seek safety when there's war all around you? Agu meets the commandant who's leading a rebel force. It's largely comprised of young men and some child soldiers. They're heavily armed, and it lets you know kind of what's going on here, right? One of the soldiers who initially came across Agu, he really didn't pay him any mind as he regarded him as just being a little boy. But the commandant points out that yes, he's a little boy, but he can move, he has hands, and with that he's able to pull a trigger, so he can be made into a soldier. Despite his small size, the commandant explains that he's going to take him under his personal leadership. He's going to train him and turn him into a soldier, and kind of begins the process of attempting to brainwash him. He explains that he's going to take him into the rebel group and that he's going to train him to kill the soldiers that killed his father, that killed his family. So it's kind of like putting the battery in his back. Part of being in the camp, they're trained as far as like how to handle weapons, how to clean weapons. If you think of it, it's like basic training. But as part of this, they're in the midst of this war. They're rebels and they're being indoctrinated into the rebel cause. So the rebel leaders are explaining why they're fighting this war. There's definitely some propaganda at play here. There's manipulation, right? They're indoctrinating these kids, these new recruits into their cause, sort of like breaking them down a bit. So you see Agu, he's there. He's made to sit while all the other boys are sitting around eating, right? He's been walking all day, carrying weapons, carrying supplies and whatnot. Everyone else is eating. And he asks, you know, can they dish out some food for him? You know, they give to everyone else, but they don't distribute any to him. When he's asked, he's ridiculed. He's made to stand on top of a stool, right? It's like this thing of breaking him down. At the same time, the commandant is nearby and he calls for one of the boys, who turns out to be Stryker. He runs off and it's like, you know, there's some funny business here, because you see the young boy goes, he salutes the commandant who's standing outside of like his makeshift hut thing. He goes inside and the commandant follows him in. What would you have to discuss with this little boy that you would need to separate him from everyone else, and especially call him into like your cabin thing, which just the two of you inside? A lot of these boys, and a number of them are boys, most of them are young men, but not much older, maybe at most in their early 20s. We can assume that they've lost their families. They've lost a lot. The commandant kind of draws them in, indoctrinates them, and wins them over to his cause by explaining that they're fighting against this thing that's bigger than them. They are now a part of this thing that's bigger than them. He is going to help them get revenge for the loss of their families. So it's like having lost everything else with no one else looking out for them. Essentially, he tells them, teaches them that he's going to be here for them. This rebel group, this brotherhood you're now a part of is going to be your family. We're going to help you get revenge for the family you lost. And we're going to help you fight back against those people that have ignored you for so long, that have taken everything from you. It's manipulation. It's propaganda, right? So as with many things of this nature, there are rituals for you to go through. Like you see this in different things, like criminal enterprises. You see this in the military. You even see it in the police, gangs and whatnot. This forming of brotherhood, right? Hazing, indoctrination, breaking people down, going through hardship, suffering to bring people into the fold. Then as part of that, explaining to them that in joining our group, you're now becoming a part of this bigger thing. I'm not saying it's completely wrong, but it's also not right, because we see that they're also willing to kill their own. So it's not, everything's not on the up and up, right? Like as they're passing through the gauntlet, one of the other boys, like the young men are beating him. And I think one of the boys, like he falls or something like that. Agu notices it, and the boy is taken off to the side where they slit his throat. They kill him. You know, there's a funeral pyre where there's a body burning on it. They cut the boys, then bury them. Sort of this thing of, if you think of it as like basic training, right? The military, breaking them down. They state, we're going to kill you so that you can be born again. And so with that, they move from training, from pretending, practicing to the real deal, at which point they start to go out and start fighting. They ambush a military convoy, at which point they kill everyone, search the people, the soldiers, the vehicles. And the commandant commands Agu, as part of his further indoctrination, to kill one of the men, to personally look him in the eye and kill him not with a gun, but with a machete. And under pressure, he does so. At this moment, he pushes the point. He stresses to them that these are the people that killed Agu's father. And it's like just that quickly, he's indoctrinated into killing. He goes from being an innocent little boy to being a soldier, right? To being a rebel. There's a brief pause, a moment of uncertainty, but the pressure from the commandant and the other boys standing around compels him to do it. With that, he gets into it. He's a bit hesitant to strike the first blow, but after Stryker steps up and does the same, he follows up with other blows. It's outwardly easier for him, right? In a voiceover, he explains that he's killed a man. It's the worst of sins. His parents have raised him to be religious, but in these circumstances, in this mission, it's the right thing to do. He's been indoctrinated. He's now part of the group and receives a gun, but there's still a little bit of resistance there. Because you see, immediately after being given the gun and being congratulated by the other boys, he steps away and throws up. They take over the vehicles. It's a few pickup trucks. And whereas before they were dressed in like rags, Agu was like wearing like flip-flops or whatever, he's given one of the soldiers' uniforms as well as a pair of boots. So they're moving around and kind of scavenging along the way, getting what they can, hunting people down and whatnot. Like they hunt down a bush rat and eat that. You know, it's like whatever they can find, they gather up and they consume. The commander is explaining to them, kind of amping them up as they move on to a new village. He's telling them that, you know, there's all kinds of food, there's fish, there's an abundance of any and everything they might want. In addition, there's beautiful women. Like really just amping them up about this new place, getting them excited about it. It's giving them motivation to march on. But in the process, while having this conversation, while giving them this prep talk, some refugees from a local village come to speak to them and let them know that their village had been taken over a few days earlier. Most of the people had been killed, but these few had been allowed to let go. They request help, or rather the commandant offers to help them retake their village. And so with that, we see them progress from like a little skirmish on the roadside where they've caught these fighters off guard, or they didn't even really look like fighters, to now this full-on fight with the opposition. And so there's heavy fighting within the village, and it's a bit of luck, right? Because Agu is standing in front of a concrete pillar and a bullet lands at his feet, rather a shell. He bends down to look at it, and a bullet hits like the pillar behind him. It's a very close call. Had he not bent, had he not been doing anything else in that second, he likely would have died. It shows you the danger they're in, right? We see that some of their soldiers are like pinned down under heavy fire. You look around and you see just how young these boys are. They send in the first wave, but it's not enough to take the village. They're pinned down and they now need reinforcements. And so at this point, the second group now is Agu and just other boys. Sure, they have rifles, they have rocket launchers, but they're just boys. And so the commandant kind of like rushes them into danger to fight, right? Like you have this thing again about music. If you think back to early in the movie, right, when Agu's at church with his family, they're dancing and whatnot. It's a joyous thing. It's a way of building community. But here we see them gearing up to go into war. And it's like, again, music is used as a way of amping them up. Community, brotherhood, getting them motivated to go into war, into what might be death for some of them. So they march into battle, amped up by the commandant's speech. And with that, they take the village, but not without also taking heavy losses. I think it's mentioned that like 11 of the rebels die. And that's not even taking into consideration the fighters on the other side. We see that the shooting is done. Agu has found something in one of the boys' pockets. But what I found telling was that Stryker takes him to the commandant so that he can give it over. Agu is walking into the building where the commandant has taken over as like his quarters, right? He's been given a uniform and boots, but you look at it in this scene and you realize just what a small boy he is. The pants are entirely too big. The shoes look too big. Like the pants look like 2 or 3 sizes too big, like both with regards to length and just like the width of the legs. And so we see here the commandant seems like he's kind of grooming Agu, right? He sees something special in him, that he can be a leader, this, that, whatnot. Really just this continued manipulation. He asks him if he can keep a secret. And you kind of get the sense that he molests Agu, that he takes advantage of this little boy. And it kind of makes you wonder what he might have been doing to Stryker previously, right? Like in the scene earlier in his cabin. The camera kind of shifts a bit. And we see the commandant laying down in his bed. Agu later comes outside and he looks like he's not crying or anything like that, not outwardly, but he looks distraught. Stryker leads him away, hugs and comforts him, likely because Stryker knows what he's just gone through. So in the midst of this destruction, all of this dysfunction, actually, Agu has this terrible experience, which is something I've always thought about, right? If you think of it, this is a fictional story here, right? But similar things have taken place in reality, like in the Congo with the boys' war. Then you have these young boys who have lost their family, or just through the devastation of war, feel that they have no other alternatives. They join these rebel groups, these fighting groups and whatnot. They're taken away from their families. Some of them are quite young. What kind of supervision are they receiving, right? Like, who's looking out for them? Who's to say that these leaders of these groups are upstanding men or positive examples of manhood? Going into war as an adult can be extremely devastating. It can have tremendous impact on an individual's psyche. So imagine being a boy going off to fight in a war, the psychological impact that might have. Even as an adult, you don't know who you are, but this is what you go into. Who's to say that these men that are over you, and not just because they're men, but just because they're adults and you're children without any supervision, without a family member who cares about you, who cares for you, who's keeping you safe from them? When lawlessness is prevailing, who's protecting you? Who's to say beyond just the fighting what other horrors and atrocities you've seen and experienced, outside of war? I could just imagine, look at this as being very similar to gangs, right? When you're a small boy, it's unclear exactly how old Agu is, but he doesn't look to be much older than maybe 10 years old. When you're in a group like this, surrounded by grown men who show themselves as being very unscrupulous, willing to do every and anything, who's to say that they might not be doing things to you as well, beyond just the fighting? They take a village and enter a home. They've been given orders to kill everyone. We see Agu, regardless of whatever he's displaying to them, that he's still holding out hope of finding his mother. And so in that, going through the house, they're destroying stuff, knocking things over. They come across what appears to be a mother and daughter, right? Stryker attacks the little girl, and Agu mistakes the woman for his mother. They attack the little girl and kill her. And in the midst of this, one of the older boys attacks and rapes the older woman. The woman, she's not old, right? When you have lawlessness like this going on, we still see there's some good in Agu, of a kind, right? He sees the woman, he takes pity on her. It's an act of violence, but can also be seen as an act of mercy, in that he shoots and kills the woman, because they were going to probably do far worse to her. They were pretty much going to torture her and then kill her anyway. But Agu puts her out of her misery. The camera shifts up, he walks away and looks out the window, and you see it's just bedlam in the streets of the village. People are being rounded up and killed. There's just violence and destruction everywhere, torture. It's one thing to do what's necessary in battle, and then there's going overboard, torturing people, committing acts of terrorism, barbarism. They're really just annihilating people. So you see that the commandant was likely molesting Stryker, right? But as they fight, they move up in the ranks. He moves Agu and Stryker closer to him. It's like this progression. They become part of his crew, like the soldiers closest to him, which would make you wonder, was this also what happened to some of the other young men who surround him, the other ones who are high up in rankings within his group? There's a roadblock where they meet rebels. They're part of the same group. But here again, you see this thing of these very young boys, young men, right? They're the fighting force. They're out on the front lines. They arrive in the village and it's heavily fortified, because this is where the big man, the boss's boss is, right? The commandant has been called in to meet with him. So they're there, He's there to see the higher up people. They're grown men. Number one, they're dressed in suits and whatnot. The commandant and the rest of the group, they arrive in the village. It's heavily fortified because this is like where the boss rebel man is, right? And so he's called in for a meeting. The higher up people who are like safe, they're grown men. They're dressed in suits. And you see them sitting around. The commandant comes in, he's out fighting and whatnot. They're all told to leave their weapons outside. When they enter, there's an Asian man who's sitting there. The commandant sits down next to him. As time goes by, hours seemingly, because it goes from being day to night, you see various men dressed in suits and whatnot coming and going, being called in before the commandant. And so you see that he's out there fighting. These guys are dressed in suits. I highly doubt they're doing any fighting. But he sees these men come in and leave before him, and he gets tired of waiting and says something. They don't bring them water. They don't offer them any refreshments. They just bring them in and have them sit and wait. It's not until he starts fussing that they're finally given some kind of a welcome. Even on arriving in the town, right? Like he asks, what kind of welcome is this? That they have to stop at the roadblock. You know, it's just like these little things along the way. You know, they're made to wait. They're made to sit by. And it shows like he's not the big man here. You know, the big man goes out of his way. It's like his boss goes out of his way to show him disrespect. So out comes the big boss in like the Miami Vice jacket. It's like a linen suit jacket with short sleeves. The commandant has lost favor, right? He might be losing his position because you kind of get the vibe from their arrival in the city that instead of them being welcomed with open arms, it's like just disrespect after disrespect. He seems like he's on his way out. The boys are taken away, given food, they're eating and whatnot. They've been getting by on scraps, but here it is that they're being treated to a feast. The boss explains there's been a change of plan. It's obvious, you know, this was kind of like a dressing down of sorts, right? The commandant has been relieved of his duties as leader of the battalion, and his second in command is being promoted. So effectively, he's being moved into the position, right, of like head of security or something like that. He's not at all happy about this. So with that, the commandant, he takes the boys out for drinks, food, women, and whatnot. And while they're at this, let's say, hangout spot, the older boys and himself, they divide up the women, right? Agu, Stryker, and the younger boys are left sitting watching TV. So the second in command, I think his name is Tutsi, is brought in by the other boys. After hearing a gunshot, right? You hear a gunshot go off. And he's like spurting blood from a wound. Doesn't look very good. The commandant comes in and he's, oh, you know what happened? They shot my man. Tutsi recognizing the situation because it's like, what are the odds that this just so happens to happen on the night that he's been told he's going to, you know, move up to being leader of the group? You know, the commandant was not happy about this change. And suddenly here it is that Tutsi finds himself shot. The woman that he'd been with, apologizes and said that she'd been playing with his gun. The gun went off and struck him in the abdomen. But Tutsi realizes, right, recognizes this as being nonsense, that pretty much the commandant, not wanting to give up control of the group, has orchestrated what's pretty much a hit on him. And kind of, he plays up this role. He turns around and shoots the lady that runs the place, right? Because it seemed like when they entered, they most likely know each other. She recognized him when he came in. She welcomed him, told him that they'd had things arranged and whatnot, set up for him. But then he turns around and shoots her, right? Seemingly on the surface trying to promote this story of that her girl, you know, set up his second in command. But the commandant probably got in her ear, probably gave her a little bit of money and had her give the girl direction to shoot Tutsi and killed her to kind of like clean up loose ends. But then he pretends to be distraught at the loss. You know, Tutsi holds on for a day or two, but ultimately ends up dying. In the last moments, you know, as things are closing out for him, he speaks to Agu and kind of tells him that this war, the stuff they've been doing has pretty much been for nothing. They give him a send-off. You know, he's been with the group for quite some time and is well respected within the group. But the commandant gives him a proper send-off, you know, but uses this as an opportunity to prepare them, right? To prepare the boys, explaining to them that from here on out, they're no longer taking orders from the man above him. They're just going to be taking orders from him. They're going to go where he says. They're going to do what he says. They're going to take whatever they get instead of kicking it up to the big man. They're going to keep it for themselves. So I think part of the issue as well, as him being relieved of his duties, is that he asked for his cut of the resources, the things that they'd been gathering up over this time. It sounds like he'd been kicking up whatever they gathered to the big boss, right? As well as like whatever business dealings they might have had as a result of the war. Money changes hands during wars. That's usually why they're fought. And so when he asked the boss about his share, the big man kind of like poo-pooed that, right? Dismissed him, as that's not something for him to worry about. So here it is that he's losing his position. He's not getting like money or whatever he probably thought would be his cut. And so that kind of throws his plans into a tailspin. They move out, they leave the city, and they're now on their own. But in the midst of this, the fighting continues. It seems as though this war is never going to stop. And so while they batten down for the night, right, there's a strike, destroying their vehicles. The commandant, the big boss, who's probably found out about them going off on their own, launches an attack against them. Or I'm assuming that he's the one attacking them. And so they lose more soldiers. They actually lose more of the older boys, some of the mainstays that we've seen throughout the film, throughout the time of them being together. And it's devastating because in a short space of time, they've lost other fighters along the way. But here, they've lost some of the older fighters who kind of provided the foundation for the group. So they've turned their back on the big boss. They lost out on resources, right? They're fighting. They don't have bullets. And now, not only do they have to worry about the army, they also have to worry about the boss and the rest of the rebel force. So it goes back to the earlier conversation that the commandant had with Agu, where he was explaining to Agu, telling him that he reminded him of himself as a little boy and Agu being a leader. The thing where you have different people, some who are born to be leaders, some who are born to be followers, and then people who are just born to live to die, right? They're just waiting for death. He sees himself as being a leader, and Agu as well. Agu explains that he's a follower. He doesn't have a driving need to be in control. And so here you see that the commandant has miscalculated. He's decided to go out on his own. He's killed or arranged for the murder of Tutsi without really putting in any plans in place for how he's going to sustain himself without the support of the big boss. And so it calls into question him speaking about leaders versus followers, where as a follower, sure, he was leading the group, but that was with the support of the big boss. He was following the big boss. Being solely responsible for them is something different. He proves himself that he hasn't thought far enough ahead. He hasn't strategized enough to really assume full control and responsibility for the group. And here we see that the people under him, the boys under him, they realize that this is a losing battle. They have no bullets. How are they supposed to fight? And so with that, one of the boys steps forward and states that he's leaving. They're leaving. He has the gumption to step up and speak to the commandant, whereas the others just kind of stand by. But the commandant kind of pushes the point, and it's at that point that the boys kind of stand up for themselves and stand against him. He's created this army that will now turn against him, even Agu, because they see the hopelessness of the situation. Sure, he's manipulated them, he's indoctrinated them, he's attempted to brainwash them, but they're not, at this point, they've been out fighting for months. In the middle of battle, it's like they've lost that driving force, right? They've lost the fight. They recognize this. He's miscalculated and assumes that they're still on his side, but he doesn't realize just how much things have changed. There's a scene where he speaks to Agu. He tells Agu, that he's his son and he's his father, as like a way of kind of building a bond, explaining to him that the two of them are going to take care of each other. But the reality is, what kind of father, and I'm not saying fathers don't, but I don't think most would, what kind of decent father would take advantage of their son as he's been doing to Agu? He's just doing all the wrong things and has really overestimated himself. The boys want to leave and he miscalculates thinking that Agu is going to stay, that some of the other boys are going to stay. And he kind of turns his back on them, only to turn around and find that it's not just one or two of them, but the entire group of them pretty much abandons him. When leaving the camp, they come across some soldiers, some UN soldiers, who take them in. Fortunately, it's not the regular soldiers or the rebels, so they don't really have much of any danger to fear, right? The UN shouldn't do them any harm. They're taken to what looks like a camp or something along those lines for the boys, and Agu's kind of isolated himself from the other boys. We see them running, playing, having a good time, being regular boys, right? And there's like a teacher who rolls up and he's like, or at least he's the leader, and you see the boys are so excited, they run out to him, they're happy. But Agu kind of hangs back. He pulls him aside later, and he shows like this drawing that he's made of things that he's done, the things he's seen. He's the same age as most of the boys, right? They all seem to be about the same age. But the things that he's done and the things that he's seen has changed him. It's impacted him quite powerfully, and he's haunted by these things. We see some of the older boys, one in particular, preacher, right? Agu, they're struggling to adjust to not being at war, right? They distrust everything and everyone. So even in this place that's seemingly nice, they think they're being poisoned, right? By being given food. So Preacher and one of the other boys, they take off and head back into the bush just because they've seen and been through too much, right? The older boy seems to be more like in his teens. So he's likely been in this for several years longer than Agu. He's more indoctrinated. It's like for him to now come back, to transition back into this environment and expectations for him to be a normal boy, it's like he's struggling. So they head back out, but I think it's telling that Agu stays behind, that while he's struggling to adjust, he at least remains behind and tries. Show notes are available on the Noir Histoire website via the link in the episode description. If you enjoyed this episode and want more movie recommendations, subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell, and check out my movie review playlist.